Peace, peace, and welcome to another discussion, Cook on Quarantine. This is going to be, I can already tell, my favorite episode because I kind of get to go back to school, and it shouldn't be because I wasn't that good in college. And this is probably one of the professors that I would have worked incredibly hard on the paper and got a C minus, but really enjoyed the process of writing it anyway. Miss Elizabeth Todd-Breland is a professor in the great state of Illinois. She also serves on the Board of Education in Chicago. I have her book with me, A Political Education, Politics, the Black Politics Education Reform in Chicago since the 1960s, which I bought 2 copies of. The way that she cataloged the history of education reform in this book is pretty astounding. And so I'm excited to get into this work with her, to hear more about her story and some of the things that led her to public service. Professor Todd-Breland, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's start with how you're doing. How are you today?
I'm doing okay today. This quarantine life, sometimes it's day by day, but today is a good day. It's sunny outside, being hopeful and trying to suck in some positivity. So today's good. What about yourself?
I'm chilling. I noticed that. So we're recording this on July 23rd, and you're in Chicago. I didn't know. Is there some sort of like ode to Michael Jordan every 23rd day of the month? Is that like something that happens?
No, it's not really a thing. Maybe every day is an ode to Michael Jordan.
Okay.
The legacy looms large, particularly when your current team is not good at all.
Remember, we were great at one point. We had number 23. The history of Chicago is something that you're well versed in. And in your book, you lay out all the various ways schools have been attempted to reform in service of improving outcomes for Black children and some of the other political realities. The reputation of Chicago politics is world renowned. A lot of education reform movements that you sort of detail in the book. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write it.
You want the long version or the short version?
Let's start with the short version.
Okay, I'll give you the short version. The short version is that I was a graduate student. I came to Chicago initially as a graduate student in 2004. And I came to do my PhD in history. But while I was doing my dissertation work, or prior to dissertation, doctoral work, I ended up spending a lot of time in schools on a volunteer basis, and then later in various job capacities. Worked in after-school programs, worked as a high school college counselor, both in the summertime and within a school setting, co-taught a social studies class for high school students. And so I was spending a lot of time in schools. And at some point, I was studying histories that overlapped with what I was spending all this time doing in my volunteer time or other jobs that I had. And it just made sense that I should be nurturing both of these interests and passions, history and education, through my doctoral studies and what ended up being a dissertation that later became a book. And there's some interesting moments, I guess, that really crystallized that for me. I'll just give one example. At the time, I was working in a charter school. And the charter school that I was working at was also the site of one of the community control programs that I was researching from the 1960s. And so it was this very present and clear moment of seeing these multiple generations of reform within the same Black community and within the same actual school building, and thinking about the very different ways that those things were playing out in the 1960s versus the early 2000s. And another sort of, I call this a coincidence, but it's Chicago. So it's not a coincidence. Like, Chicago works like this, where when I was in that school, I actually was working with the granddaughter of the woman who was the director of the community control project from the 1960s, a woman named Dr. Barbara Sizemore. Mm-hmm. And so these moments just made it, I felt, was confirmation that there was an important story to tell here and to continue to pursue that story. And so the research took me there.
That's one of the big things that struck me as I was reading the book, was that how much of this is familiar. And serving on the school board of San Francisco and reading about these different waves of reform ideas that took root and who was the catalyst for it. I'm like, dang, this has happened before. Like, we've been having this debate about integration versus community control versus like, you know, in a way that you captured the Urban League as like the moderation mediation group that was kind of raising a lot of money from white liberals or what have you. And so I was wondering, and this is kind of a big question, but you're so well versed in this history and now you make policy, right? So for me, let me tell you my take on it. Like reading the book, for me, it was sort of maybe comforting to know that like these weren't new issues, but it was kind of frustrating that these were still the same issues, you know? So how does your historical expertise inform like your service?
Yeah. I mean, well, one, yes and yes. So I think often people will say that history repeats itself. I don't necessarily think that's true, but sort of other historians sometimes talk about history rhyming or there being a sort of more cyclical nature to some of the phenomena that we see. And I definitely think that's the case. The point you made about debates over integration or community control, and that we still see some of those tensions playing out in education policy today. Although what I would say is that I think the historical context matters. So we'll use that example with integration, community control, or desegregation, the movement for desegregation in the 1960s, early 1960s, and then a shift for more assertive calls for community control. Part of what precipitated this shift to more assertive calls for community control, one is that those always existed prior to and during the desegregation era as well. But I think they became even more prominent as two things were happening. One, as the promises of desegregation, both in the South and the North, were not being met, were being violated in many ways. And so people were having a frustration with that. And then I think the other thing that you see happening is the new money that's coming into education from the federal government. So in the mid-1960s, a number of different social programs are put in place as part of the war on poverty. And one of those big sources was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which created more federal funds than had ever come to local school districts. And so with that, along with other things, Office of Economic Opportunity, other types of war on poverty funds that were coming into cities in particular and coming into Black communities in particular, there was a demand by folks in the community that the local political machine or other politicians or other people outside of their community should not be the ones to decide how those new monies were going to be spent. And so in the 1960s, the demand for community control is coming at the same time that these new federal funds are coming in, and folks are saying, no, we decide how this money is going to be spent. We have a better understanding of what's in the best interest of our young people. Young people themselves were part of this demanding community control of schools. Shift to today, where I think we largely often operate in systems where the presumption is austerity, right? Rollbacks, in our current context, we're calling for more federal money, right? So I think that the context in which those dynamics and the questions and issues that play out is different based on the historical context of the moment. But I think you're right to point out the similarities in some of these themes. The other thing that sometimes folks ask me and I talk about is like, I think it's also interesting on the funding piece. If you look, whether it's desegregation, community control, other sorts of pedagogical interventions, all of these different education reform efforts, the thing that it's always coupled with is a demand for more funding, whether that's municipal funding, state funding, federal funding, funding from corporations, whoever the money's coming, there's always a funding demand that comes with these various strategic or tactical changes. But the thing that happens is never the money or very rarely the money, right? So yeah, okay, we'll try this new pedagogy, but we're not going to fully fund it. Or yeah, we might think about desegregation, but only in this really limited capacity and not in a way that's going to increase, the amounts of funds that need to be put forward towards it. With community control, yeah, but it's okay until you start making too many decisions that those in power don't have control actually over, and then you're messing with money that we care more about, and so that's not going to be part of it. So that is something that you see happen across time, right? That these demands for various things are always coupled with these demands for funding, and it's the funding part that rarely comes through at the level that would be needed for some of these strategies to actually be successful.
you referenced research at the time that highlighted the reasons why achievement wasn't moving, and how sort of like this developed this narrative that developed around like a Black pathology connected to, you know, families not emphasizing education enough in the home, and that's still recurring. That's still something that's discussed as an explanation for why achievement hasn't moved. And I think like the similarity thing that I was also trying to get to between, is it integration? Is it desegregation? Is it community control? Like what's happened to student achievement? You know, like what is happening to student? It's like, at least in San Francisco, it hasn't moved. It hasn't moved significantly in terms of like those indicators that we associate with proficiency that everyone bases the achievement gap on. Now, you also elevate the rise and fall of the Black population that kind of like spanned it over this time. And so I think my big frustration is seeing these flights play out and kids' lives not improving generationally. And us clinging to, I would say, like the pathology, and you're better with the words and the historical, like
say what you gonna say.
the historical explanations, but there is this like internal pathology within the Black community around emphasizing elevating individual success to justify like progress, you know? And so like, even when you're talking about Harold Washington and, you know, him being pretty much a cog in the democratic machine before he became like this completely new like brand of leader that built these coalitions or whatever, and how his success was affirmation that the community control approach was effective, you know? So like, I had a conversation with another educator about this recently, like, like it's all, unless student achievement is moving, it's bullshit. Unless student achievement is moving. So, you know, how do you respond to that? And then I kind of want to get into some more reform conversations.
Yeah. Oh, so you talked about a lot of things there. Let me see where to start.
I apologize.
No, it's okay. It's good. As I start responding, if I miss some things, bring me back. Okay. But I want to start at something you said in the beginning about these ideas of Black pathology, because I think one of the things you see at that same time I was talking about before in the 1960s really come to a head are ideas of Black pathology in the social science community and in the government that are being backed by, and I'm putting this in air quotes, right, official research, right? So that you see something like the Moynihan Report, which was a report by social scientist Daniel Moynihan, who also was an important leader in the government. And he's putting forth these ideas of Black inferiority, Black pathology, something being inherently wrong with the Black family as part of the reasoning for, you know, discrimination, right? As part of the reasoning for the conditions that many Black folks were finding themselves in. In the education sphere, so that was 1965, I believe. In 1966, the Coleman Report comes out, which is a report that focuses on education, again, specifically around a social scientific report that is being funded by the government, a massive social scientific report about student achievement. And it has some interesting results, and people take those results in different ways, right? So one of the things that they say is that it kind of undermines the idea of integration in a certain way, because it says, well, or the ways that integration works. It ultimately, one of the findings ultimately is that the best way, it says, the report, to improve Black achievement, educational achievement, is to take poor Black children and put them with middle-class white children. And that will like help to improve them. At the same time that it also says in this report that if you really want to help Black families and Black children succeed, you need to get them out of poverty, which means direct money to those families, right? So it's these kind of like conflicting conclusions.
I like the first part. I like the second part. The first part.
Not the first part. Exactly, right?
The first part, I can't get with that. But that's the same. Sorry to interrupt you, but like that's the same. Like we're having this whole debate now about school assignment, and you know, my brothers and sisters in the Black community, like they're staking their future on sending their kids across the city to attend like all white schools. The community schools discussion feels like an attack on their child's future, right? And at the same time, when you look at the experience of Black children in these like non-diverse settings, it's awful. But then we have this whole the pathology is like, well, you need that to, adjust well to life. And so like this conversation activates me, you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. No.
But the direct money piece, we settled on the first part, that the Coleman report. We believe, some of us believe that if we do that, it's possible. We haven't really got to the second part, like direct money to families.
Schools alone cannot solve these problems of educational achievement for Black students in particular. That if Black students and Black families are disproportionately in poverty, then what those families need is to not be insecure by poverty and to be more stable, not because of some internal family dysfunction, but because they are impoverished and need money and need to be able to live a stable standard of living, right? Which relates, and we can get to this, like these conversations about universal basic income and whatnot that are being had right now. But I think what's interesting is that with both Coleman and this idea about putting, poor Black children around middle-class white children, that's also in some ways what undergirds the Brown decision, right? That the Brown decision was saying separate is inherently unequal. Well, yeah, but it's unequal. Black schools are inherently inferior, but it does not say that all white schools are inherently inferior. So this also, and like the leanings, the structure of the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education decision, around these psychological reasons for why integration needs to happen, interpersonal reasons for why integration needs to happen, rather than what actually many of the demands from Black people who were calling for desegregation were for, which was equitable resources, right? It ignores the structural and instead focuses on this interpersonal. And so I think, again, those are things that we see repeating themselves again and again. But there's certainly, right, like to your point, it's not just happening in social science. It's not just happening in government. But I think why it's important that it's happening in social science and government is because that then drives policy and parts of policy, because clearly universal basic income wasn't picked up on, although incidentally, it was actually Nixon's administration that most closely came to guaranteeing people some type of, putting a floor on income.
Yeah, the Brown decision, which I've never actually gone on record on criticizing, so I should do that now.
Not all bad. I don't want to, it's a really important piece of jurisprudence. There are things, but even I guess part of what I want to emphasize is that even at the time, or not right, there were people very wary about Brown in 1954, right? There are people, Black folks, who came out and were like, I don't know about this, or I'm worried that what this is going to actually mean is the firing of lots of Black teachers, which it did, particularly in the South. That was one of the outgrowths of desegregation. But that even some of those folks who were involved, people like Derek Bell, right, who were very much involved in some of the litigation around desegregation, ultimately looked back and said, I don't know if that was the best strategy or tactic, even though it seemed to be something that we had traction with and seemed to be the direction to go at the time.
Yeah, I understand you're going to do the nuanced, balanced, historical approach, and then I could just riff on the real ignorant stuff.
Tell me how you feel.
This is why I would have got to see your class.
Tell them why you mad.
And I know all these things aren't, there is nuance and hindsight. It's very easy for me to be judgmental of whatever, right? Looking at it 50 plus years later. One of the things that your book made me think about, because you reference a bunch of people, you talk about people out here, the Black Panthers, Terry Francois, that's based out here. You make a reference to him. One of our first Black supervisors in San Francisco. Is that someone's going to do an account of what we did here, when we had these positions. And a lot of the book kind of focuses on the actors that pushed school policy in a new direction, not necessarily the people that were in our positions being the impetus for change, like the mayor's agenda, the superintendent's way of thinking, and these like, really incredible Black women that you elevate that helped move these different ideas forward. And so as I was reading, I was like, I got to get off the school board and push it. So I could be in a book that the next Elizabeth Todd-Breland writes. But who were some of your favorite, I don't know if you want to say favorite, but who were some people that really inspired you that you came across in your research in the book?
Sure. Gosh, so many different people. I guess maybe I'll start with some of the people who I actually had the opportunity to interview. So some folks I talked about have since passed, but when some of even the people I interviewed have since passed. But some of the really incredible folks I got to speak with and interview were just amazing. As you mentioned, particularly Black women. I think one in particular, or two, I'll sort of elevate in particular that I've had an opportunity to have multiple conversations with. One is Rosie Simpson. She was and is, she's alive, is a Black woman from Chicago. She grew up, or she was born in the South, moved up to Chicago as a young person, went to historically Black high school here in the city, and she actually dropped out of high school. And when she dropped out of high school in the 1940s, it was at a time where there were jobs available in meatpacking. So meatpacking, huge industry here in the city at the time. She dropped out of high school because it was war. It was coming off World War II. There were jobs available increasingly for Black folks, increasingly for Black women in these spaces. She worked in meatpacking as like a 15-year-old, I think, when she started. But it was through there actually that she became involved with the Meatpackers Union. And it was in that labor organizing space that some of her first organizing happened. She then moved and did some work with the NAACP. And by the time I kind of pick up with her in my story, it's in the early 1960s, and she's a parent living in Inglewood on the south side of Chicago. And the city is trying to install portable mobile classrooms at her child's school. And this was one of the tactics that were used to keep segregation of schools. So Black schools were overcrowded. Rather than allow Black children seats in nearby white schools, they would bring on mobile units, portable classrooms, and keep kids segregated in those schools. This was beyond that. So that was the first attempt. They were like, oh, well, we're going to move you. There's so many kids here. We're going to move your kids to this like warehouse that was like a former, I think, Goodwill Industries or something. We're going to move them to this warehouse. There's like wires and stuff. The parents were like, no, we're not having this. They were like, okay, we'll regroup. Another plan that was put forward was to create not just portable classrooms on the campus of their existing school, but to create an all mobile classroom campus between a railroad tracks and an alleyway for Black students to address this overcrowding again, rather than allow them. And this was in a community, I should say, that was in the process of integrating. So this was the Black part at this point, but there were open seats in very close by at nearby schools. And so Rosie Simpson organized her community. She organized other parents and young people. They had young people from CORE, from the Friends of SNCC coming down to help them out. And they laid down in front of the bulldozers that were trying to install these portable classrooms in a sort of direct action protest. But from there, she continued to be active. She helped to organize a massive one-day boycott of Chicago public schools, where more than I think it was nearly quarter of a million students stayed home from schools to boycott in the fall of 1963. And she was just an incredible person to talk to. She's a great storyteller. Because she's still living, I've had the opportunity since the book came out to be on panels with her, to continue to have conversation with her. And she's just always super inspirational. So that's for sure one person. The other person I would lift up is a woman named Lily Peoples. And Lily Peoples has since passed, but she was an amazing teacher organizer, Black woman teacher organizer. And so in addition, I mentioned this mobile classroom thing. Another tactic that was used to maintain segregated schools and keep overcrowded Black schools, keep Black students in overcrowded schools in their own neighborhoods was double and triple shifts. So there were so many kids. A set of kids would, come to school for several hours in the morning. They'd leave, and another set of students would come in for several hours in the afternoon. Basically, kids were getting half of an education in order to maintain segregation. And one of the things that Lily People said to me in her interviews with her that was really interesting, she was like, that had a profound impact on students, but I was a teacher in a school like that. And it was also a terrible conditions to be trying to teach in. And I think it was those teaching conditions that really activated her to become a larger organizer in her community, an organizer within all the schools that she worked in. She worked on getting better representation for Black folks in the teachers union. She worked on both desegregation and community control in her various, over the course of her career. But she was a really incredible person. She one of the groups she organized with was Operation Breadbasket's Teachers Division, which is Operation Breadbasket came out of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from the South. They had an outpost in Chicago that Jesse Jackson led. It has since become Operation Push, but she was a major teacher organizer with that group as well. So both really just deeply inspiring Black women who are doing amazing work in the city.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Where'd you grow up?
So I'm not from Chicago. I was born in Washington, D.C. My mother's from Pittsburgh. My father's from Baltimore. But I grew up in D.C. And then in elementary school, we moved to suburban Maryland, so Silver Spring, Maryland. Finished high school there. So that is where I'm from. My family's still there. Lots of family in Baltimore in that area.
Yeah. And you're a parent?
I am a parent. I have two girls.
Of school-age children?
One of my children is school age. The other is pending. Soon. She just turned 4. My little one just turned 4. So
that's awesome. I kind of want to tease out this issue of integration, desegregation, and what's best. And so, as you talked about the historical context, you mentioned like money, some type of allocation of money not being there or being there long enough to implement ideas. One of the, I would never say that like I want to see segregation happen.
Sure.
But I think like what I want to see more is great schools being built that people don't believe need to include white people in order to be great. And so like that's like and I'm sure there are a number of schools around the country, rural white areas that aren't great, right? But that was like some of the things you pulled up that was in the Brown advocacy, which was like obviously pushed by the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall. I went to Thurgood Marshall High School,
Okay.
And so and my thinking on this has really shifted a lot over the course of my journey and being around in education. Like I want to see, like I'm kind of over the push for integration, and because I think something's getting lost, deeply getting lost, and inherent in it is that inferiority, which may not be intended, but that's how it comes off to me. So maybe for me too, it's kind of like, now I'm gonna prove that this can happen in this neighborhood, and it can just be with this community, And so, where are you at on that?
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting, and let me bring it to the work, because one of the things that I think is interesting in sort of looking at this history is that one of the terms I talk about in the book is something called the politics of Black achievement. And it's this idea that a lot of the folks once I would sort of start to read more of what they were saying or get into what they're following their actions on the ground, it wasn't really about a strict adherence to a particular ideology, right? I wouldn't even call it ideology, strategy and tactic, right? It wasn't, folks were moving in and out of organizing for desegregation to organizing for community control to creating independent Black institutions that did not take state money of any kind, and moving kind of in and out and back and forth through these spaces and tactics and strategies. And so I was trying to find a way to capture, I guess, how to make sense of that ideology rather than strategy and tactic. And so I came up with this, or I landed on, I should say, this idea of the politics of Black achievement, where folks were less wedded to a particular strategy or tactic and more interested in, I guess, the outcome, right? Like what is going to get to that place of an achievement. I should say, like, achievement is loaded. Achievement has lots of different meanings to different people. Largely, I would say for the folks I was looking at, achievement always inherently included, what we would call now like culturally sustaining curriculum. It included like thinking about holistic achievement, not just a test score. This woman, Dr. Barbara Sizemore, and I feel like she's kind of a case in point in this, right? Where her career was fascinating. She started out as a teacher. She's from Indiana. She moved with her family to Evanston, Illinois. She finished high school out there and then went to Northwestern University, had a very sort of strong experience in all Black schools in Indiana, and then less positive experiences in integrated schools. She had a difficult experience at Northwestern, where she was one of very few Black students at the time. And so I think she was wary of integration, and she was probably wary of it at a time when that was the major strategy and tactic of the civil rights movement. So she wasn't necessarily in line with that. At one point, she was advocating for a school that she was the principal of, an all-Black school on the west side of Chicago, and showing the achievement gains that they had made using a variety of pedagogical techniques that she had been implementing there with her staff. And she was told by some of the civil rights leadership in the city, not now, this is not the time to be talking about success at all Black schools. We're fighting for desegregation. Yes, maybe this is working for where you are, but at a lot of places it's not working. She was derided and called Aunt Barbara in like publications. And so she had a really interesting journey. She ended up being a major advocate for community control. She led this community control movement and project in the city at this the Woodlawn Experimental Schools Project. Then later, she became the first Black woman to be superintendent at DC public schools, which was fun because that let me go home and do some research at home. For that part, I got to be deep in the DC library.
Right.
So I got to go home for that research. And then later, though, she moved to Pittsburgh. She was a major Black studies professor out there. But in Pittsburgh, she was working on desegregation because to her, that's what justice, that's what liberation for Black people looked like in that context. That was what the tactic and strategy to get to that space would be. When she was in Chicago and Woodlawn, community control seemed to be the tactic and strategy that would lead to Black liberation. I think I'm perhaps a bit agnostic on the strategies and more interested in what is the context in any place and what seems to, at least in Black education, right? Like what is going to give, and like, I think of, it's hard to see a space, for example, in a school system with very few white students where focusing on desegregation as the major thrust of like what education policy looks like doesn't then also marginalize the vast majority of students who continue to go to school in highly segregated spaces. That doesn't mean that work isn't important too, but I think if that's what, everything is framed around, then you end up focusing on a smaller segment of the population than you would otherwise. The other thing I'll say, and I mean, I talk about this frequently, when we say desegregation, we generally mean students of color broadly going to school with white children. Like we don't talk about a, Black and Latinx school as desegregated, right? That's a student of color school. So I think even the way, like, the logics of white supremacy are so strong that it shapes even the nature of the ways that we talk about this conversation, that we have this conversation. It certainly structures the history of it, but the space to have these conversations is also structured by those logics in really deep and profound ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I think part of when I say I'm over it is, I mean, there's multiple things, there's multiple reasons for that, and I get the approach of being agnostic to the strategy and tactics, right, and what is liberation supposed to mean when I consider cities that have large Black populations like Baltimore. And DC. DC is obviously changed. Chicago, in the context of San Francisco, our Black population is all but gone.
Yeah.
And when families, and I don't have children, right? Yeah. So like when families are thinking about where to send their kids to school, they kind of want to know they want their kid to be safe. They're thinking about a lot of different factors, and there's a climate reality at schools that have like more affluent families in terms of just the calmness. It doesn't mean that it's always safe and friendly. And then some of our other sites, our majority, African, Black and brown schools, like it's a little more activated and things aren't as like safe and friendly all the time, it's like visibly. So I know there's people are thinking about that and not just like, oh, it's this white because it's better. You know what I'm saying? And it's not that cut and dry, but the work to build those spaces where it's just quality, right? And we can kind of put the other stuff to the side because we really have to focus on just like kids gaining competency and feeling great about who they are and where they're from and knowing their true history. And when I also say I'm over it too, I'm thinking about my own journey and really associate.
Because you were born and raised in San Francisco, right?
Yeah, I was, but in high school, I really associated successful whiteness. Like I really thought like that, you know, like I was like, I'm not going to a HBCU, like crazy. That's where all the rejects go. I'm going to an elite selective white school, you know. I really thought like that. And so I went to one. And then I was like, oh, this is not, why not go to Howard? You know what I'm saying? And so, but based on your example, the being agnostic to the strategies, like I chose one direction and I came back to the place where like, okay, well, liberation has to look like, it has to look like this now. When you say black student achievement, the politics of black student achievement, what is the status, what is the state of black student achievement currently in Chicago?
It's a hard question. I mean, I think to your point, well, I just want to touch on one thing you just said a second ago, because I think it's important and it relates to something historical we talked about a moment before. So to your point about people chasing, that it's not necessarily always about chasing whiteness to go into these all white spaces. I think it's also what it has been before, which is chasing resources, right? If those are better resource spaces, that there's not something, again, inherently better about those spaces because white people are present, but resources that follow white people are there, right? Resources that are not incidentally there, but there because of white supremacy are also there, right? And I think that that's something that we see everywhere, right? And so and I think something that was part of the critique that people who were like, no, we need to pursue a strategy of desegregation, because ultimately, in some ways, it's both. So this is the thing, like there are multiple ways that people come to desegregation. Some of it might be because of a deep belief in the importance of intercultural or interpersonal interaction, and there are lots of things that support that as well, right? But some people also get to that space out of like, look, I don't trust the government to ever treat Black people fairly. So the best way to get Black people treated fairly and get them the resources that we deserve is to be together with white people who we know are going to get the resources, right? And so I think just to your point, I think there are multiple reasons why the phenomenon that you discussed in your own experience that you see that.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for cleaning that up, because I sounded real ignorant. But
you did not.
I'm joking. It's okay. You did not. I make fun of myself sometimes. It's all good.
Okay.
But what you are saying related to like what I was thinking about. I was thinking about resources. I wasn't thinking about just because like I'm gonna be out in rural Tennessee with a bunch of like white people that can't read, and it's gonna be better, you know.
Yeah.
I wanted to go to this place that was associated with a ranking and money and network and getting in made me feel validated, you know, which people kind of do a lot with college. So that whole aspect was like a part of the decision. It wasn't just like, oh, it's white because it's better. All that stuff was connected to it.
But you were asking about achievement. I mean, I think, look, not just in Chicago, but nationally, we know that opportunity gaps are real. And in the way that I talk about the politics of Black achievement historically, I do think that's a historically specific way and idea of thinking about it. And I think what we see today is a continuation in many ways of what we've seen historically, around the fact that, what were we just saying, right? Like the resources necessary, not just within schools, but our broader communities, right? We're continuing to struggle to get the investments in our broader communities that would allow our communities to be at a place where we could, be as healthy and robust and amazing as we know our communities could be. And so I think that that historic disinvestment in Black communities shows up in schools, and it also continues in schools, right? And so really trying hard to shift that is difficult. And it's difficult, again, in a context where the sort of prevailing politics is a politics of austerity, right? That, oh, there's not enough money. No, there's money in our society, right? We're just making choices about where it goes and who has it. So every time, it was actually a pretty striking graph I saw recently, like a live action animation that was showing the decrease in the corporate tax rate since the mid 20th century, right? the corporate tax rate used to be like really high. And also the income tax rate, right? Like for really wealthy people used to be quite high, 50, 60, 70% of their income, right? In the mid 20th century. These were boom
That
times.
sounds absurd. I'm glad.
I no, see, I knew it was coming. Bougie.
You ain't
No,
gonna tax me like that.
listen, but look, at that time, that was a time of prosperity. Those were boom times in the US economy, and corporations and individuals were being taxed at those high rates. Today, those have plummeted, right? So that you can be a working class, working parent paying more in your taxes than your millionaire counterpart on the other side of the city. And so I think this idea that we don't have money as a society, this politics of austerity that we get trapped in is false. There are decisions being made about who gets to have money and who does not. And we're shamed for it too, right? Like you see that right now today. So this is July 23rd. They're debating in Congress, right, what this next round of stimulus money is going to look like. Or I don't even know what they're calling it, stimulus, whatever they're calling it, the package that is necessary so that people don't default on their mortgages, stop paying rent, etc., are able to live, have food, maybe still get evicted anyway, right? The conversation when they say things like, yeah, this extra $600 a week or whatever it is for unemployment is going to make it so that people don't work, or those are not conversations had about billionaires. Those are not conversations had about, other people who are less marginal, who are less struggling. But there's just such a lack of a social safety net. And the social safety net in the last 50 years that did exist has been so terribly decimated that we're in the place where we are now. And I think if nothing, this quarantine and the COVID it's not just that it's exposed existing racial and economic inequities, it's exacerbated them. And when you look at the public institutions that are functioning enough, and often barely because we're strapped too, it ends up being the schools, right? Like schools have been the places that are feeding people. I mean, mutual aid as well, which I think is really important. But at a governmental level, schools are the places where people are coming to eat, right? Children and families are getting their food. And so you see this over reliance on schools as the almost last or best functioning part of the social safety net, when we have largely defunded all of these other parts of the social safety net, whether that be direct aid to families, whether that be unemployment, whether that be healthcare. We can go on and on to almost every sector of society. Housing, the lack of affordable housing, on and on and on. And so you see schools taking the weight of a lot of that in this moment, always, I'm going to say always, but particularly in the moment that we're in right now. My worry is that will only, again, like with this virus, exacerbate existing inequities.
It's interesting. We talked about Black student achievement. One of the things that I often tell families, Black families especially, is if you're going to trust the school system to ensure your kid has a great education, like, you got a foul idea about what, like, what it's going to take to actually provide the necessary tools for advancement. And I went through this system, and I went to an elite college, right? And elite, I don't think of it that way. That's how the world. I don't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's one of those
No,
indicators of success that it's like whatever, right? Because I don't really place value in that anymore at this stage in my life. But it comes back to this thing that we do around the individual, like we'll do like, oh yeah, I did it and then I got it. But then you look at the masses, right? Or what's collectively happening around achievement, and it's not moving. It's not moving in a way where we can say, like, this is working, or we could also say it's working the way it's supposed to, So with the social safety net, like that's the reality. And for me, it's like troubling. Like if this is going to be the backbone for the community, and you see what it's doing generationally to sort of help keep stagnant the Black community, not it on its own. Like there's there's law enforcement and like racist, policing, there's like all this other stuff surrounding it. But like we need something greater, And so we talked a lot about the external.
Yes.
And there's also this part about the internal. Like what does it require of us as people or connected to one another in order to move ourselves forward, you know? So I kind of want to step into that before we wrap up, but you sound like you want to say something related to.
It was something you said about individualism. I mean, I think this is sort of this has been one of the major critiques of Black politics more generally, since sort of I'd say people debate when the civil rights era ended, but since like the late 60s, early 70s, right, is that as some individuals were able to traverse the system, as there were opportunities provided for a group of Black folks to become part of the middle class, to gain access to spaces that perhaps they did not previously have access to. That happens, but that's both sort of in jobs, but also you can think about it in neighborhoods, right? So as you know, Black people make more money and are able to leave some of the neighborhoods they were previously segregated in, whether that's to another neighborhood in the city or further out into a suburb or whatever the case may be. That with it in some ways undermines the collective effort of what Black politics, the potential of Black politics. Now, that's not to say there was always major fracturing within Black politics, but this idea that there was a greater sense of a collective condition that required collective action. I think the lure of individualism, the appeal of individualism, frankly, the indoctrination of individualism as part of this project that is the United States of America, which is, you know, a colonial and white supremacist project, very much stresses the importance of individualism. And that often comes counter to some of the best ways in which progress has been made for Black folks, but for other folks as well, which has been through collective solidarity. And so I think those things, that tension is something that's very real and continues to be a struggle on a macro level as well.
You're right. And, you know, I've been having more people on the podcast from Africa, actually, and mostly in tech, you know, in Ghana and Kenya and hopefully some more. And you know, we've been talking about like these dynamics exist across the diaspora and multiple sectors. And there is this energy around collectivism. It's kind of like, you know, maybe it's just the tribe. Like you find the people with the same mindset, because like you mentioned, there's fractures and there's been splits or whatever. And hopefully what I want to do with this platform, Cook On, Quarantine Cook On Monday Morning, is elevate more of those people that share that interest in building with one another. Yeah.
Can I say something about that quick? One thing I would like to lift up Chicago for is historically and continuing today, there's just such a really rich organizing tradition of collective action. Sometimes that's, you know, interracial, sometimes that's not, sometimes that's around labor, a really long history of labor organizing here, particularly in more recent days, you know, a more progressive labor movement in the city, folks reaching a working class movement across people of color in the city. And I think you're seeing that right now, particularly around some of the police abolition and defunding movements that are happening, not just in Chicago, but across the country. But I'm not I don't want to suggest that there's not collective action to happen or collective organizing. Chicago is an organizing city. Listen, people, they stay organizing. So I think that's a good thing and a great quality of the city. And that tension between, you know, that individualism and collectivity, though, I think is something that every, you know, humans continue to struggle with.
Right. Absolutely. So we have a few minutes left. I have a rapid fire round of questions that I ask every guest.
Okay.
You ready?
I'm going to try. Okay.
You're gonna do great.
Okay. This is my time to get a C. Go ahead.
Do you meditate?
Sometimes.
What's a book you would recommend?
Okay, you're lifting up my book, A Political Education. Sure, read my book. But I was just thinking about this is a random book that I read a few years ago called Zero Fade by Chris L. Terry. And it's a little book, but it's about this kid growing up in Richmond, Virginia in like the 90s. And there's a lot of like early hip hop references, but it's also a really touching story about family. It's a young adult reader, but definitely translates to adults as well. So I'll say that.
What personal weakness can you forgive in someone?
Being cleanly. Like overly clean, you know, and being clean. I thought that sounded bad. Being clean is a good thing, but you know, people who are like, people who are like super, like everything has to go in plate, like constantly wiping things down. Right now, in particular, I'll take that all day, every day. Like my mother, I can't leave a cup on like a table, or it'll be gone within 3 minutes, and that used to really irk me. But now she can wipe it down. Wipe everything down.
Yeah. Do you have a motto?
No. Maybe I should get one.
Last and final question.
Okay.
Who's going to win the presidential election?
Not Donald Trump. Final answer.
I thought the Kanye West, like Chicago, loyalty.
No. I'm not stepping in that, baby.
This was Elizabeth Todd-Breland, author of A Political Education, Black Politics, and Education Reform in Chicago since the 1960s. Member of the Chicago Board of Education, mother, educator, all around, A student. Hella dope.
Thank you for having me.
It was great to have you. Peace, and thank you for listening to another episode of Cook on Monday Morning. At Cook on Monday Morning, we believe that if you own Monday morning, you can own the week. If you own the week, you can own the year. And if you change your year, you can change your life. I had the very dynamic professor, Miss Elizabeth Todd-Breland, today, and I really appreciate her taking the time. I'm going to grab her book. We recorded the audio, so if you're seeing me, you stayed through the audio, and now you're looking at the YouTube, and this is her book, Political Education. You can see I did a fair amount of note taking before our discussion. Incredible wealth of knowledge about the politics of Chicago, and I'm sure well versed in several other historical topics that we didn't get a chance to discuss today. But it was great kind of interweaving her research with her story, talking about the work that she studied connects to our current work as policymakers. Me being a policymaker in San Francisco, her being on the Board of Education in Chicago. That was really insightful, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you're still with us, thank you. And please support the podcast by subscribing. Hit the subscribe button. Comment. Let me know what you thought. Share it with someone you think that might be interested. I've had a number of policymakers on the podcast, and so sharing this with anyone that's in public service, I think would be, I think they'll be well informed, especially if they serve in a city, in a high density city like San Francisco or Chicago. And even if they don't, I think it'd be useful for them. So like and subscribe to the podcast channel. Thank you in advance. This company, this platform is owned by the Luther Harris Holding Company. Luther Harris was my great grandfather. He represented a legacy of doing and making something out of nothing. I run a strategic advising and consulting practice. I help startups and nonprofits meet their strategic objectives. I also work with larger companies to help them meet their diversity goals and ensure that they are creating impacts in the communities that they do business in. If you are interested in talking to me more about any of those topics, I would be more than happy to set up a call. Just send me an email, info@stevoncook.com. You can also find me on all of the social media platforms. On LinkedIn, I'm at Stevon Cook. On Facebook, at Stevon Cook. On Twitter, at Stevon Cook. On Instagram, at Stevon Cook. I look forward to hearing from you and connecting and building with you. If you are interested in supporting the podcast in a few other ways, you can subscribe to the newsletter. Just go to my website, stevoncook.com. You'll see, a quick slot to import your newsletter. I'm sending out insights, updates, sort of distilled versions of the extended interviews that we're doing, and other stories. And so if that's something you're interested in, you can support the podcast by subscribing. I'll be sending out merchandise. We are close to launching merchandise. I've been talking about it for a minute, so I'm excited that it's coming. You can be the first to get the merchandise by subscribing to the newsletter. We'll release it there. So go to stevoncook.com and subscribe to the newsletter. Where you're at the website, stevoncook.com, you'll also see a page for a book show, and you'll see a list of books there. If you click on one of the books, it sends you to Amazon. Go through that book to do your Amazon shopping. You don't have to get the book, but when you use the link through Amazon, it's a great way to support the podcast. Keep that in mind before you do your Amazon shopping, if you shop on Amazon. We're doing something nice for all of our single mothers, and this is just a gesture of kindness and community. I am covering dinner for a single mother and her friend. So if you are a listener of the podcast and this is you, or if you know somebody you think that is deserving, feel free to send me an email, quick email. This has to be 3 or 4 sentences. Tell me a little about yourself or the person, a way to get a hold of them. Email is fine. And we're just doing something nice, saying that we know it's hard, we acknowledge your sacrifice, and we just want to treat you to something chill. We're doing it at the rate of about twice per month. So hopefully that's something that you're interested in. I want to thank the people that make this podcast possible. Mr. David Topete. Thank you, sir. Mr. Fernando Cinco Marquez. I appreciate you also, sir, for editing the newsletter. And I just want to end the podcast by showcasing a testament of love to all the people that inspire me to do this work. They are our first responders, our firefighters, our police officers, our EMT workers, our social workers. They are our educators. They are our custodians, our school lunch workers. They are our bus drivers, like my father. They clean our streets. They are our blue-collar workers. And they are our employers, our people that are giving of themselves to build, to help grow our economy, to help give purpose to people's lives and help people take care of their family. To the builders, this podcast is for you. And this podcast is for our gig workers, the people that are stocking our shelves, delivering food, getting us to and fro in rideshare services, exposing themselves to this vicious pandemic. This podcast is for you. I appreciate you. Thank you. So this podcast is for those folks, and they are in cities like San Francisco, my hometown, Oakland, Los Angeles, Dallas, Houston, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Miami, Orlando, the Carolinas, Philadelphia, Newark, Atlanta, if I didn't say that already, Cleveland, Minneapolis, Detroit, Boston. This podcast is for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for connecting with me and helping grow this community. I appreciate you. Until I see you again. Peace, and we out.